The moment I understood what the silence meant, I was standing in line at Hector's diner ordering a cup of coffee I didn't particularly need. It was a Wednesday morning in late September, the kind of morning that arrives in small towns with a particular quality of light, low and golden, coming in sideways through windows that haven't been cleaned since spring, laying itself across the counter and the vinyl stools and the faces of people who have been eating breakfast in the same seats for 20 years. I had lived in Calloway my entire life. I knew every face in that diner. I knew the rhythms of the place the way you know the rhythms of your own breathing, without thinking about it, without noticing it, simply as the ambient condition of being alive in a particular place. What I noticed that Wednesday morning, for the first time, was the quiet. Not the ordinary quiet of early breakfast. Something more specific. The brief, almost imperceptible pause that moved through the room when I pushed open the door, conversations that continued but shifted register, eyes that found me and then found somewhere else with a speed that was just slightly too deliberate. Hector himself, behind the counter, gave me a smile that was half a beat slower than his usual one. The woman at the corner table, Ruth, who had been my mother's friend for 40 years, looked at her coffee cup with an attention it didn't deserve. I ordered. I sat. I drank the coffee I didn't need. I drove home thinking about that silence, turning it over the way you turn over a stone you've nearly stepped on, not yet knowing what's underneath. My name is Cal. I was 39 years old that September. I ran a small hardware and building supply store that my father had opened before I was born and that I had taken over 12 years ago when his knees gave out and he decided he'd earned the right to fish instead of work. The store was the kind of business that a small town either needs completely or doesn't need at all, and Calloway needed it completely. We were 40 minutes from the nearest city, on a road that flooded twice a year and was under construction the rest of the time. The store was my life in the practical sense. It was also, in a less practical sense, the place where I had a better read on this town than almost anyone else, because people talk while they're buying lumber and paint and they don't always notice they're doing it. Delia and I had been married for 10 years. We had met when she moved to Calloway from the city for what she called a temporary change of pace and what turned out to be permanent, the way things sometimes are when you stop running from somewhere and start running toward something. She was 37. She taught art at the elementary school, which was a job she had taken somewhat reluctantly and come to love with a completeness that surprised her. She had a laugh that carried, and an opinion about almost everything, and a habit of rearranging furniture in the middle of the night when she couldn't sleep that I had stopped finding disorienting sometime around year 3. We had a son named Beau. He was 7, missing his 2 front teeth, deeply interested in beetles, and entirely unaware that the world his parents had built around him was in the process of a change he wouldn't understand until much later. I didn't know any of that yet, on that Wednesday morning at Hector's. What I knew was the silence. And the silence, in a town where I had lived for 39 years, was the loudest thing I had ever heard. Calloway had a population of around 2,000, depending on the season and who was counting. It had 1 diner, 1 hardware store, 1 elementary school, 1 gas station that also sold bait, and a bar called the Mill House that had been threatening to close for 15 years and somehow never did. It had the kind of social density that city people sometimes romanticize and small-town people understand as a double-edged condition. You are never anonymous, which means you are never alone, which means neither is anyone else. Delia had understood this when she married me. She had chosen it, in fact. She had said once, in the early years, that she found it comforting, the knowability of a place, the way you could walk down a street and be known. She had grown up in a city where you could live next door to someone for a decade and not know their name, and she had found that loneliness of proximity exhausting in a way she hadn't been able to name until she left it behind. I had believed her. I still believed that she had meant it when she said it. The changes I now understood as early signs had begun, I think, in the spring, 5 or 6 months before that September morning at the diner. At the time I had no framework for them and filed each one under ordinary categories. Delia had become, over that spring, somewhat more social than she had been. More evenings out. A book club she had joined the previous year had apparently expanded into something more frequent. gatherings that I understood to be casual and that she described, when I asked, in the warm, slightly vague way people describe enjoyable things that don't require much explanation. She came home from them in good form. She seemed engaged with her days in a way that I found pleasing, the way a person is pleased when someone they love is living well. There was a man named Garrett. He had come to Calloway about a year ago, which, in a town this size, made him still essentially new. He worked for a contractor outfit based in the city, overseeing a drainage infrastructure project on the East Road that had been underway, with the characteristic patience of county government, for the better part of 18 months. He came into my store regularly, buying materials, and he was the kind of man I liked on first meeting: competent, uncomplicated, easy to talk to in the way of people who are comfortable in their own skin. He asked good questions about materials. He paid on time. Delia had met him, I assumed, the way everyone in Calloway met everyone, at the mill house, at the diner, at one of the events the elementary school organized that were nominally for the children and functionally social occasions for the adults. She had mentioned him once, in the way she sometimes mentioned people she'd had a conversation with, briefly, as a passing detail. That contractor guy, Garrett, was at the school fundraiser. He bought 6 raffle tickets. He seems nice. Something to that effect. A sentence I had heard and forgotten within the same minute. I had forgotten it because I trusted Delia. 10 years and I had never had occasion not to. She was not a secretive person, or so I believed. She was expressive, opinionated, transparent in the way of people who don't operate from concealment as a default. If anything, I would have said she was less guarded than most. More likely to tell me too much than too little. That assessment was, I now know, accurate about who she had been and inaccurate about who she had been for the past several months. The physical changes were the kind I had attributed to the general energy she was carrying that spring. She had cut her hair shorter in April, which she did periodically and which suited her. She had bought a few new things, not dramatically, not in a way that announced itself, just the ordinary accumulation of someone who had been letting a wardrobe drift and had decided to refresh it. She wore a particular perfume more consistently than she used to. I had mentioned that I liked it. She had smiled and said nothing. Beau, our 7-year-old, had said something in early summer that I had registered at the time as charming and forgotten almost immediately. We had been driving home from his baseball practice and he had said, with the artless certainty of a child reporting an observable fact, "Garrett came to watch my practice. He knows Mom." I had said, "Oh, that's nice," and turned on the radio, and thought nothing further about it. I thought about it now. Driving home from Hector's diner on that September morning, with the sound of a room going quiet still in my ears. Garrett had been to my son's baseball practice. In a small town, information travels in specific ways. Not always through speech, sometimes through posture, through the particular quality of someone's eye contact, through the things that are notably absent from conversations that would normally contain them. After the diner, I began to hear all of it differently. I went into the millhouse 2 days after the diner incident, a Friday evening, the kind of unremarkable end-of-week stop I had made dozens of times. Pete, who owned the place, was his usual self, but there was a moment, when I mentioned Delia's name in passing, where something moved across his face and was suppressed before I could read it clearly. He moved on quickly. So did I. But I stayed aware. The mechanic 3 doors down from my store, a man named Vince who had a mouth that ran on its own schedule and no strong investment in other people's comfort, had been avoiding my eye for approximately 2 weeks. I had attributed this to the fact that I owed him a return call about some equipment. Now I reattributed it. Then there was the Saturday at the farmer's market. Delia had gone with Beau in the morning while I opened the store. This was normal. We had a division of Saturday mornings that had established itself over years without being discussed. I took over at 11 when she brought Beau back, and she went to meet a friend for lunch. She had mentioned the friend's name, a woman named Addie who taught at the school with her, and left in a good mood, unhurried, looking the way she always looked on a Saturday. I was restocking shelves around 2 in the afternoon when Addie herself came in to buy weather stripping. She chatted, asked about Bo, mentioned she was making a casserole for the school potluck. I said I was sure Delia would be glad to see her on Monday. Addie gave me a look, very brief, almost nothing, and said she hadn't seen Delia much lately, they kept missing each other. Not having lunch with Addie, then. I finished the weather stripping transaction and stood in my own store, among the bolts and the paint samples and the familiar smell of sawdust and machine oil, and understood that something had been happening for a while in a place where I knew everyone and where everyone, apparently, had known more than me. That weekend, I started paying attention in a different way. Not aggressively. Not in the manner of a man tearing his life apart looking for evidence. In the manner of a man who had spent his whole life reading a particular landscape and had suddenly understood that he had been reading one part of it incorrectly. Delia's phone was not something I had ever had occasion to watch. Now I watched it in the passive, peripheral way of someone who is simply paying attention to what is already visible. She set it face down when she brought it to the table, not always, but often. She had a habit, new enough that I hadn't catalogued it as a habit, of carrying it to the other room when it buzzed in the evenings. Once, on a Sunday, I saw a name flash across the screen before she picked it up. It was a single letter. A contact listed as one initial. I didn't see which letter. I saw the shape of it, the brevity, the kind of label you use when you are reducing someone to something that can be explained if seen. The following Tuesday, I drove out east on the pretense of checking on a materials delivery to the road project. The pretense was largely genuine, there was a delivery outstanding, but I was also, and I will not pretend otherwise, driving past the project to see if I could see anything I couldn't explain away. I didn't see Garrett. I did see his truck, parked not at the work site but at the edge of a gravel turnout half a mile further on, at a time when the work crew would have been at lunch. The turnout was near nothing in particular, a stand of trees, a drainage ditch, the empty road. A place that had no logistical reason to contain a parked truck unless the reason was the privacy rather than the location. I drove past. I didn't stop. I went to the building site, confirmed the delivery, exchanged a few words with the site foreman, and drove home. I sat in the store that afternoon and sold 3 boxes of screws and a gallon of exterior paint, and I thought about the truck in the turnout and the single initial on the phone screen and the room at Hector's diner going slightly, deliberately quiet. In a town this size, secrets have a limited half-life. What was keeping this one alive, I was beginning to understand, was not the secrecy of the people who knew. It was the specific, painful loyalty of people who could not bring themselves to be the one who told me. I want to be honest about the next part, because it is the part one am least comfortable with and the most necessary to tell accurately. I did something I had never done before and have not done since. I followed my wife. Not with a private investigator, not with elaborate equipment. On a Thursday evening when Delia had told me she was going to help set up for the school autumn fair, I drove, 30 minutes after she left, to the school parking lot. Her car was not there. I sat in my truck across the street from the school for a few minutes. Then I drove east. Garrett was renting a house on Birchfield Road. This was information Calloway had given me freely and without agenda, because it was simply the kind of thing people knew, the way they knew which houses were rented and by whom. The house was a gray clapboard place set back from the road, with a woodpile on the porch and a decent-sized yard that the previous tenants had left in better shape than most rentals. Delia's car was in the driveway. I drove past without stopping. I drove to the end of Birchfield Road, which terminated in a turnaround near an old feed barn, and I sat there with the engine off for approximately 10 minutes. The evening was very still. The light was going. A dog somewhere down the road was barking at something. I drove home. I was there before Delia returned. I sat in the kitchen, ate the dinner I'd made for Bo, put Bo to bed, and was reading at the kitchen table when she came in at 9:15. She said the setup had taken longer than expected. She said the gymnasium looked good, the kids would love the decorations. She asked if Bo had eaten his vegetables. She moved through the kitchen with the ease of someone who has arrived home from exactly where they said they were going, and I watched her and said the right things and felt the specific, cold clarity of a person who has been given an answer they already knew but now can no longer pretend they didn't. There was one more piece, and it came from an unexpected direction. Ruth, my mother's old friend, the woman who had found her coffee cup fascinating that morning at the diner, came into my store on a Friday afternoon and bought a bag of rock salt she didn't need and then stood at the counter for a long moment without leaving. I waited. Ruth was 71 and had lived in Calloway since before I was born, and she had the quality of someone who had seen enough of life to understand that certain things could not be left unsaid indefinitely. "Cal," she said, "I'm going to tell you something and I want you to understand that I have been trying to figure out how to tell you for 2 months." I put my hands on the counter and waited. She told me that she had seen Delia and Garrett together at the millhouse back in July, not in a way that could be attributed to coincidence or casual acquaintance. She told me that Pete had seen them together more than once. She told me that Vince the mechanic had seen Delia's car on Birchfield Road in August and had told himself it wasn't his business. She told me that 3 or 4 people in this town had been sitting with this information and had been choosing, daily, not to be the one who changed my life with it. "I should have come sooner," she said. Her voice was steady but her hands, flat on the counter, were not. I kept thinking someone else would. Or that it would resolve itself. Or that maybe I was wrong. She paused. I wasn't wrong. I thanked her. I meant it without qualification. After she left, I stood alone in the store I had run for 12 years, surrounded by the particular smell of the place, wood and metal and the faint chemical sweetness of paint, and I let myself, for the first time, feel the full weight of what I now knew. Then I locked up early, for the first time in 12 years, and went home to my son. I waited until Beau was at school. I had been deliberate about that from the beginning of the week, without fully articulating it to myself. Whatever happened in the conversation I was going to have with Delia, Beau would not be in the house for it. He was 7. He liked Beatles. He had baseball practice on Thursdays. The world I was going to dismantle was not going to land on him if I could help it. Delia was in the kitchen when I came back from the school drop-off. She was making a second cup of coffee, barefoot on the tile floor, wearing the gray sweater she'd had since before we were married. She looked up when I came in and smiled, the easy, morning smile of someone who expects nothing from the next 10 minutes. I sat down at the kitchen table. "I need to talk to you about Garrett," I said. The coffee cup went still in her hands. A silence, very short, maybe 3 seconds, that contained an entire conversation's worth of information. Then she set the cup down on the counter and turned to face me, and the morning composure had changed into something else. Not panic. Something older and more tired. The expression of someone who has been living with the weight of a secret and has just understood that it has arrived ahead of them. She sat down across from me. "How long have you known?" she asked. "I've suspected for a few weeks," I said. "I've known for certain since Thursday evening." She looked at the table. A long breath. "I was going to tell you." "When?" I asked. She didn't answer that. "Delia." I kept my voice level with effort that I hope she didn't hear. "I need you to tell me how long." She looked up. "Since June," she said. June. The school year winding down, Beau finishing first grade, the summer arriving. 4 months. Is it serious?" I asked, and hated the smallness of the word. She was quiet long enough that the answer arrived before she gave it. "I don't know what it is," she said. "I know that's not what you want to hear." "What I want to hear," I said carefully, "is the truth. Whatever that is." What followed was the kind of conversation that takes 2 hours and covers the geography of a decade. She talked about a restlessness she had been carrying for longer than June, something she hadn't known how to name and hadn't brought to me and had instead carried privately until it had found an exit she hadn't been looking for. She did not frame it as my failure. She was careful about that, and I believe she meant to be careful. She said she had found something in Garrett that she didn't know she was missing, not something better, those were her words, not something better, just something different, and she had followed it in the way of a person who convinces themselves that following a feeling is the same as understanding it. I asked her if she had thought about Beau. The silence this time was longer and more complicated. She said, every single day. And you kept going, I said. And I kept going, she said. Quietly. Without defense. I asked about the people who had known. Ruth, Pete, Vince. She looked genuinely surprised by that, not the names, but the number. She had believed, I think, that Calloway's knowledge had been more contained than it was. That in a town of 2,000 she had found adequate space for something she wanted to keep hidden. You understand, I said, that the whole town has known for months. She put her face in her hands. Not theater, genuine distress. The specific distress of someone for whom the smallness of the place they live had just become undeniable. They were protecting you, she said, from behind her hands. Not me. They were protecting both of us, I said. They just couldn't do it forever. The conversation ended not with resolution but with the particular exhausted truce of two people who have said the essential things and have nothing left to say that the next weeks and months wouldn't have to say for them. She asked me what I wanted to happen. I told her I didn't know yet. I told her I needed time to think clearly, that I needed her to give me that, and that whatever we decided about us, Beau was not going to be a casualty of it if I had anything to say about it. She said she agreed. I believed her about that, at least. I went to the store and opened up at the normal time. I sold lumber and paint and 3 boxes of screws and a length of copper pipe. I talked to my customers the way I always talked to them. Outside the front window, the golden autumn light moved slowly across the street, and the town went about its business, and I stood in the middle of it and understood that knowing a place completely does not mean the place will keep you from being surprised. It just means you find out sooner than you would have anywhere else. What happened in the months after is the part of the story that belongs to Beau as much as to Delia and me, and so I will tell it carefully. Delia and Garrett ended. This I learned through Calloway's ordinary information channels rather than through any conversation between us. It ended, as far as I could tell, within a few weeks of our conversation in the kitchen, though I did not ask about the details and she did not offer them. Garrett's infrastructure project wrapped up in November and he returned to the city, which is the kind of resolution that a small town provides and a large one would not, the physical departure of the complication. Delia and I went to counseling. A therapist in the city, 40 minutes away, which meant every session was also a 40-minute drive in which we learned, slowly and with difficulty, how to talk about things we had both been carrying without naming. The sessions were difficult in the specific way of things that are necessary. We did not go easily. We did not arrive at easy answers. But we went, and we kept going, and that choice, the sustained choice to keep showing up to a hard conversation, turned out to be more meaningful than I had expected. I will not tell you we fixed everything. Some things in a marriage, once broken, do not return to their original shape. What we built in the year after was different from what we had before, not lesser, not necessarily stronger, but more deliberate. More honest in the particular way that comes from having had the honesty made necessary. What I came to understand, over that year, was something about the town itself. Calloway had known. 2 months of knowing, and 3 or 4 people carrying the weight of someone else's secret because they could not find a way to put it down without doing damage. Ruth had been right to feel guilty about the delay. But I also understood, from the inside of a community that had held something painful rather than deploy it carelessly, that their hesitation had not been cowardice. It had been love, of the awkward and imperfect kind that doesn't always know what form to take. A town like Calloway gives you very little privacy. What it gives you instead, imperfectly, inconsistently, sometimes infuriatingly, is the sense of being held. Of mattering to the people around you in a way that is immediate and specific and has weight. I had lived here my whole life and understood this the way you understand things you have never had to articulate. The autumn after everything happened, I understood it differently. Not as background. As foreground. I opened the store every morning. I ordered lumber and paint and copper pipe. I sold what people needed. I had coffee at Hector's diner on Wednesdays, where the room no longer went quiet when I pushed open the door. Ruth sat in her corner and nodded at me. Pete poured my coffee without being asked. Vince stopped avoiding my eye. Bo lost his remaining baby teeth over the winter and grew 2 new ones that were slightly too large for his face in the way of children who are growing into themselves. He remained fascinated by beetles. He played baseball in the spring. He called Delia's counselor, the talking lady, with a 7-year-old's complete accuracy. One evening, driving him home from practice, he said, "Dad, is everything okay now?" I thought about the question with the seriousness it deserved. "It's getting there," I said. He considered this. "Okay," he said. And turned to look out the window at the fields going by in the late light, satisfied with the answer in the way of children who ask the real questions and then trust you to mean what you say. I drove us home through a town I had known my whole life, which had known me in return, which had held a secret it couldn't hold forever, which had given me, in the end, the only thing a community can honestly offer, not protection from what is real, but company in living with it. I thought about what Delia had said in the kitchen that morning. They were protecting you. Not me. I thought, they were protecting all of us. They just knew, the way everyone in a small town eventually knows, that some things can't be protected forever. That the truth, in a place where everyone's lives are visible to each other, was always going to find its way to the surface. In Calloway, it just found it faster than most places would have. Cal's story carries a layer of complexity that most betrayal narratives don't. The community itself becomes a character, carrying information, choosing silence, and eventually delivering the truth through its most human and imperfect channels. To understand what happened here, you have to look at 3 things simultaneously: what Delia did, why the town stayed quiet, and what Cal's eventual understanding of both reveals about love in close proximity. Delia's affair unfolded under conditions she had fundamentally miscalculated. She had moved to Calloway precisely because she wanted to be known, to live in a place where people were visible to each other in a way the city had never offered her. And yet when she made a choice she needed to conceal, she operated as if she were still in that anonymous city. She used Addie's name as cover. She met Garrett in a town where her car was recognizable at a glance. She trusted that the same community closeness she had chosen for its warmth would not turn its visibility against her. This was the central miscalculation, and it was rooted in a blindness specific to people who understand a place theoretically but haven't yet tested it against their own behavior. The town's silence is the story's most psychologically complex element. Ruth, Pete, and Vince were not passive. They were actively choosing, day after day, not to be the instrument of Cal's pain, which is a form of caring that contains within it a corresponding failure. Their hesitation was understandable, human, and ultimately wrong, not because telling was obviously right but because silence, sustained over months, became its own kind of deception. Cal experienced this as a community that knew before he did, which is a specific loneliness, being the last person in a room to understand what everyone else is managing around you. Would you have told him? That is not a rhetorical question, it is the moral weight this story places on every person who has ever known something difficult about someone they care for. Cal's blind spot was the specific trust of a man who had never been given reason for suspicion. He read the room at Hector's correctly. He noticed the truck on the gravel turnout. He connected Addie's absence from the lunch that wasn't. But he did all of this after the fact, after the silence had already told him something was wrong. Before that morning at the diner, he had been reading the surface of his marriage and finding it satisfactory, not because he was careless, but because the surface had been maintained. Delia had not withdrawn from him. She had added something and kept the rest in place. That kind of betrayal is particularly disorienting because there is no visible loss to respond to until the truth arrives all at once. The lesson Cal carries forward is not simply about trust. It is about the difference between knowing a person and knowing what that person is carrying. He knew Delia thoroughly and accurately in most dimensions. He did not know what she was carrying internally, the restlessness she hadn't named, the feeling she described as not being missing but different. That unnamed internal weather is where the affair had room to grow, and it had room because neither of them had found a way to bring it into conversation before it found another exit. What makes Cal's story universally resonant is that its setting, the small town where everyone knows everyone, functions as a magnifying glass rather than a unique condition. The dynamics it amplifies exist everywhere: the people who know and don't tell, the person being protected who becomes the last to understand, the betrayal that operates in plain sight because the one person who most needs to see it is also the one most insulated from seeing it by the depth of their own trust. Delia's internal logic, examined closely, follows the pattern of self-deception that sustains most long-running affairs: the belief that the emotional justification, the restlessness, the feeling of something missing, makes the method of addressing it more acceptable than it is. She was not wrong that something in her had gone unnamed. She was wrong in the conclusion she drew from that, which was that acting on it privately was a form of self-knowledge rather than a form of avoidance. The accumulation effect is visible throughout. No single moment was catastrophic. A mention of a name at a fundraiser. A baseball practice. A gravel turnout. A face going still when a name was spoken. Each piece was almost nothing. Together they formed a picture that had been visible to half a town for 2 months before it reached the one person it most directly concerned. What Cal ultimately reclaimed was not the marriage as it had been, but something harder and more valuable, a more honest version of it, built on the ruins of one that had contained a silence it couldn't sustain. The counseling, the continued choice to show up, the specific dignity of a man who grieved without spectacle and rebuilt without bitterness, these are not small things. They are the quiet counterweight to everything the story put him through. What stays with me is Bo in the car, asking, "Is everything okay now?" And Cal saying, "It's getting there." That answer is so much braver than it sounds. Not yes. Not a reassurance designed to close the question. Just the truth, offered at a level a 7-year-old could receive it, honest without being heavy. I think that's what small towns teach you, at their best. That you cannot hide indefinitely in a place where you are truly known. And that being truly known, even when it costs you, even when it strips away the version of yourself you were maintaining, is ultimately less lonely than the alternative. The hardest thing is not being found out. It's deciding what to do with the truth once it's been found.